Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere or sometime along an infinite line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 261, The IP Agent's Choice, read by Mitchell II. Opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, getting ahead might require genetic alterations. Kenzo put the ultra-quiet drone into a hover. The people below were packed in so tight, the scene reminded him of a cornfield swaying in a Great Plains breeze. He had initially trained in an intellectual property theft unit, flying drones over canola fields just north of the old Canadian border, searching for unlicensed crops and livestock. Since the beginning of the new era, genes responsible for bioluminescence in sea pickles had been altered to react to a specific wavelength of laser light and spliced into all proprietary genetic modifications in plants, animals, and humans. So, patent-protected life fluoresced in the ultraviolet when hit by a specially modified laser mounted to the underside of a drone. It was the most efficient way for the biotech industry to protect its intellectual property and limit its theft. Kenzo quickly became an expert spotter and rose up through the ranks to become an enforcement agent for Sand Genetics IP, the most significant patent protection firm in Cascadia. Looking for human infractions wasn't all that much different than scanning crops, Kenzo reflected, watching the video feed. Sporting events and outdoor concerts, like the music festival his drone was currently hovering over, made ideal targets. Just like a farmer's field, he'd fly over an event, spraying it with laser light to look for fluorescent skin. Minute variations in the spectrum of the light a target's skin fluoresced encoded the manufacturer's ID and the type of alteration. From there, using facial and gait recognition, it was simple to verify if a person with the genetic marker was licensed and up to date on their payments. The AIs did the checking. All Kenzo had to do was capture the raw data. Instead of methodically grinding through a grid search pattern like most agents, Kenzo had a sixth sense about where to look. He couldn't explain it. Possibly, he was simply picking up on subtle behavioral clues. Regardless, he had the uncanny ability to zero in on the most likely place to find a suspect in a crowd. He directed the drone to drift lower, then over to one corner of the open-air amphitheater, where a group of teens were waiting in the shade of a pole tent for the concert to begin. Kenzo directed the drone to scan the area and immediately got a hit from a young man with blonde hair in a muscle shirt. The AI only took a second to pull up the relevant information on Kenzo's contact lenses. The man had an eye color mod that was popular with celebrities and the exclusive property of an international cosmetics conglomerate. Even without looking at the report, it was evident to Kenzo the kid didn't have the money for that kind of mod. As he suspected, the young man's medical records claimed he was completely baseline, which meant the mod was black market and unlicensed. It was a minor misdemeanor, punishable by a fine, a couple of demerit points on the offender's social credit score, and the immediate reversal of the mod. Kenzo had the AI fill out the summons for the former, but he was obliged to deliver the latter before he could move on. He prepped a hypodermic mosquito dart with the appropriate viral carrier, then had the drone drop down and fire it at the offender. Kenzo recorded the man slapping the back of his neck where the dart had penetrated to prove the rollback injection had been administered. The guy's enhanced eye color would revert to whatever it had been by the time he received the ticket. Kenzo swung the drone away, anticipating another boring day recording minor infractions, when his AI assistant highlighted something unusual, something he hadn't seen before. He had a mosquito dart tag the target with a tracker so he could follow up later if the patent holder wanted to pursue enforcement, and moved on. Harper swatted her cheek where a bug had just bitten her. She twisted around to see if there were more, and caught a fleeting glance of a drone, but when she looked up, it was already gone. She wondered why a drone would be hovering over them, then assured herself she was just being paranoid. She was at a music festival, and there were camera drones everywhere, vying for the best positions to record the bands. It was probably just gathering B-roll of the crowds, and her mother didn't watch concert videos, so even if she was in a shot, she was unlikely to be seen by her. "Are you all right?" Revel, her best friend, asked. "I'm fine, but I think I just got bitten by a bug." Revel pulled Harper out of the shade. "I read someplace that bugs don't like sunlight." Harper pointed to a small red mark on her cheek. "Can you take a look?" Her friend leaned in and examined it. "There's a small welt. I've got some cream if you want to cover it up." "Thanks, but I think it's already going away," Harper said, touching the spot again. Cuts and minor injuries had always healed so fast that she had never needed to treat them. She figured the bite, or whatever it was, would be gone by the time she got home. Her mother had said her father had been the same and that she should feel lucky. But there were other things too. Learning came easy. She had been at the top of every class she took. She was athletically gifted as well, limited only by her photosensitivity. So she had to avoid outdoor sports. Her mother claimed her sensitivity to sunlight also came from her father, whom she had never met and never would. He had been killed in an accident when she was very young. At least, that is what her mother claimed, although she didn't seem to have any pictures of him. Like most genetic problems, there was a fix if you had enough money. Her mother was saving up so that she could get the modification by the time she turned 20. But until then, Harper had to cover herself from head to foot when she went outside. That was until today. "Here," Revel handed Harper a spray applicator. "Maybe you should put on more sunblock, just in case." "I'm not sure it'll keep the bugs away. Maybe they're attracted to it," Harper joked, accepting the can and spraying a small amount on her hand before rubbing it on her cheek. It stung for a few seconds where the insect had broken the skin. She felt good about wearing regular clothes for once and was glad she had let Revel talk her into trying sunblock instead of wearing the heavy, UV-proof clothes her mother insisted on. Still feeling cautious, Harper stepped back into the shade. Although she hadn't reacted to the sunlight, she still wasn't entirely convinced Revel's idea would work. "Your skin looks fine," Revel pointed out. "You're not going to burst into flames. Now, let's find a place to sit before they're all taken." Harper didn't move. "Okay, we'll make sure it's in the shade," her friend added, pulling her along behind her. Harper heard a commotion at one of the gates and turned to see an unusually tall teen being roughly escorted out by two corporate IP agents in dark suits. One had a distinctive gene-modded physique she recognized from an ad, no doubt a perk of the job, she guessed. "I wonder what that's about," she said, pulling Revel around to watch. "Isn't it obvious? They've been scanning the crowd," Revel explained in an exasperated tone. "The guy probably got caught with a bootleg mod. We're not modded, so there's nothing to worry about. Come on, let's get going. There are only a few good seats left." It had been a busy day, and Kenzo felt emotionally and physically drained. Targeting the festival had paid off. They had tagged dozens of minor infractions and a significant number of major cases, which required immediate collection. However, one incident bothered him. They had tagged an unusually tall teen who had tried to run when he spotted them approaching. It had taken him and another agent to restrain the kid before he escaped through one of the festival's gates. "I'll lose my scholarship," the kid had cried, tears running down his cheeks. He pleaded with them to let him go as they dragged him to the collection van. He had bootlegged height and agility enhancements, probably bought for pennies on the dollar, in some backstreet lab by the kid or his parents. Height was not reversible, but Kenzo knew agility was easily changed. In this case, the patent holder was within their right to insist on a punitive rollback. So the kid had a good chance of ending up as an uncoordinated beanpole that would be useless on a basketball court. The sports scholarship would be gone, and along with it, any chance of the kid getting out of the flood. He'd end up scraping by, like everyone else, on the occasional gig, living in one of the thousands of converted shipping containers piled up on the old cargo ships run aground on the mudflats of what the locals called the Flood. The Flood had been the former Vancouver suburb of Richmond before it disappeared under the rising waters of the Pacific. Kenzo understood that unlicensed mods could not be allowed to spread. Left unchecked, they would undermine the value of the intellectual property that drove the new biotech economy. Maybe it was because he was tired, but today the tall kid had somehow gotten to him. He was thinking about that and looking forward to the end of his shift when a message popped up in his contact lens. Regarding the unusual target, we are consulting with the patent holder. While we wait for a response, you are to keep the infraction under surveillance. Kenzo cursed. Now he'd have to work until a decision was made, and who knew how long that would take. Several hours later, Kenzo, dressed in plain clothes, waited in the shadows across from the main exit near the old fairgrounds on East Hastings. The skeletal remains of an ancient roller coaster rose above a small, struggling urban forest planted decades ago to help cool the city. It separated the open-air amphitheater where the festival was being held from the street. The tracker showed the target approaching the gate along the pedestrian walkway which connected the two. A group of kids emerged first, followed by two young women, one wearing a large sun hat. He fluoresced them with a portable laser to confirm which one was the target, then watched as they walked to a transit stop. He crossed the street when they weren't looking and followed them until they stopped. Casually, Kenzo positioned himself at the back of the small group waiting for the next bus. As they swept through the exit at the end of the day, Harper was exhilarated. It had been the first time she had gone somewhere and felt like she was just another person in the crowd rather than an oddity too poor to afford the fix for her photosensitivity. The only compromise had been the hat which she put on when the sun, in the late afternoon, had dropped low enough to get under the canopy she and Revel had been sitting under. "That was a great idea," she said gleefully, grabbing her friend and giving her a hug. "I don't know why my mother never thought of it." Revel smiled. "See, I told you, a broad-spectrum block would work. I know it's expensive, but it's still better than being covered head to foot in a UV tent every time I go out." Harper beamed. "Are you going to tell your mother?" "Not until tomorrow, just in case I still react." Suddenly feeling less confident, Harper glanced at her bare arms, then held out a forearm to examine it more closely. Finding no sign of a rash, she asked, "How's my face?" "You look fine," Revel sighed impatiently. "We've been through this before. The pharmacist said the sunblock is 100% effective. You're going to be okay, really." Harper wasn't sure if it was just guilt, but she had the feeling something was going to go wrong and began wondering if she had done the right thing after all. They walked to a transit stop where a small crowd was beginning to gather and took the first trolley bus headed to the Flood, choosing to stand at the front. Bored after a couple of blocks, Harper began examining the other passengers. Up until then, she would have been dressed in her tent-like UV protection gear, eliciting disapproving, hostile stares. Today, no one was paying attention to her, except a man at the back who looked away when her eyes connected with him. There was something about the way the man held himself that Harper recognized. He was Gene-modded, like the IP agent at the festival grounds. Was it the same person, she wondered. Kenzo quickly turned away, cursing himself for staring at the target. It was a rookie mistake, but he'd been fascinated by the young woman. There was something Sagenetics suspected, but wasn't telling him, and that had never happened before. Usually, she would have been immediately picked up for a rollback. So, why had he been asked to hold off and follow her? Kenzo stared out a side window, trying to watch her reflection in the glass. The young woman was engaged in an animated discussion with her friend, occasionally glancing his way. The two eventually got off along the seawall road, which sat atop the concrete berm which held back the ocean from the rest of the city. Instead of taking a water taxi, they walked toward the massive rusting hulk of the OOCL Hong Kong, one of the first container ships to be permanently beached along the old banks of the Fraser River, where the flooding had finally been halted by the wall and the higher ground to the north. Kenzo got off at the next stop and jogged back to the Hong Kong just in time to see the woman climb up the metal stairs welded to the hull plates and enter the superstructure several stories above the waterline. A new message from Sagenetics rolled across the top of his contacts. He read it, then leaned against the seawall, watching the entrance to the old container ship, thinking. The mods the target's skin had fluoresced were the property of Aphrodite International, an exclusive clinic used by elite, wealthy families to design and deliver their children. Bound by non-disclosure agreements with their clients, Aphrodite had refused to confirm whether they had a record of the target. However, they wanted Sagenetics to obtain blood and cheek swabs, which was highly unusual. Harper had changed back into her UV protective clothing at Revels, then made her way along a scaffold to her mother's container near the bow of the ancient freighter. She and her mother counted themselves as lucky. Their unit was above deck, so it had windows which looked out onto the rusting containers stacked next to them. It was not a great view, but better than looking at a corrugated metal wall in a below-deck unit. Decades ago, an Indian company discovered converting decommissioned cargo ships loaded with containers into instant flood-resistant apartments was more profitable than scrapping them. Coastal cities sinking beneath the rising waters, desperate to house their displaced populations, had snapped them up. The old north bank of the Fraser River was now so tightly packed with the rusting hulks that multiple rows of the things almost hid the mudflats they had been run aground on. People had nicknamed the beached ships the Stacks, and demand was so intense there was a lottery to get in. Harper and her mother had been lucky to win a place on one of the older cargo ships after the previous tenant moved to a container on one of the newest ones. When Harper came through the door, she half expected her mother to have discovered her indiscretion. Instead, she just momentarily glanced up from the ancient second-hand tablet she had been reading. "Did you have a good time?" her mother asked, distractedly. She was still dressed in her work clothes, and an empty food container lay abandoned on the small table. "I worked overtime, so I bought takeout. There's another one in the cooler. How was the festival?" Harper was relieved that her mother didn't suspect she hadn't used the protective gear as she walked over to the cooler and took out the other food container. "I had fun," Harper said, considering whether she should wait until the next day to come clean about the sunblock. She had just sat down when there was a knock at the door. Kenzo had waited on the seawall outside the OOCL Hong Kong for almost an hour, thinking. Usually, he wasn't involved in target collection. His true talent was infringement identification. But today, there had been so many infractions that he had been pressed into service, and the kid he had to drag out of the concert earlier was still weighing on his mind. It was one thing to tag someone from a drone. They were just targets on a screen. Collection was another matter. Face to face, it was hard to see targets as nothing more than an infraction. Another message scrolled across his lenses, asking for an update. Kenzo shook off his funk and reluctantly started up the stairs to the entrance cut into the side of the old ship. The tracker had located the target in a container 2 tiers above deck toward the bow of the freighter. When he found the correct container, he knocked and waited, then knocked harder when no one answered. "I'm from Say Genetics IP. I need to talk to you," he bellowed at the rusty steel door. There was an exchange of hushed, anxious voices, then the door opened a crack. "Say Genetics IP," Kenzo repeated, holding his wrist out so whoever was on the other side could scan it and verify who he was. He felt the tickle of laser light from an old data tablet, then the door swung open, leaving him facing a terrified-looking woman in her mid-50s, wearing a lab coat with an Aphrodite Labs logo emblazoned on one breast. Under that was a name tag, Sophia Diaz. The patent holder's logo was the last thing he had expected to see. Behind the woman, the target stood, dressed head to foot in some kind of protective clothing, with a worried look on her face. "I need to come in," he explained. Not waiting for an answer, he pushed his way into the cramped space and nodded at the younger woman. "She was at a concert today and was tagged by one of our drones. I need to do a mouth swab and take blood for genetics IP infraction testing." The older woman moved to block his way. "No," she objected. "She's never been modded. You must be mistaken." Kenzo took out a small tablet, flipped through several menus, then handed the device to the older woman. She stared at the screen, then back at the target, anger flashing across her face. "Harper, you didn't wear your protective clothing!" she exclaimed, then broke down, tears rolling down her cheeks. She slumped into a chair. "I didn't have to," the target, who was obviously the older woman's daughter, almost whispered. "I used sunblock and it worked. See?" She held out an arm defiantly. "No rash." The mother, now completely distraught, dropped her head into her hands. "It was never about a skin condition," she moaned. "You don't react to sunlight. You never did." I don't understand, Mom. Why did I have to wear that stuff then?" the daughter asked, her defiance rapidly evaporating. "Because," the mother lifted her head and nodded at Kenzo. "Because of them. The clothes weren't meant to block the sun. They were designed to stop the lasers they use to find unlicensed genetic modifications. Sunscreen doesn't work for that. The clothes do." "I still don't understand. I don't have any modifications. Right?" the daughter tried to confirm. The mother gave her daughter a pained expression, and Kenzo knew she hadn't told her. The kid had no idea what her mother had done. He began to feel sick about what would likely happen to the teen. "You were designed, Harper," the mother finally admitted after a pause. "You have the best mods money can buy, stuff only the rich can afford. It was the only way to have a child in the stacks that had even a small chance of getting out of here, and it paid off. You're smart, you won a scholarship. You just had to stay covered up until you were 20. 20? The daughter questioned, seemingly unable or unwilling to accept what she had just been told. "That's when they were going to release the fake licenses for your modifications. When you turned 20, it was their way to keep me quiet. After 20 years, they figured there'd be no one interested enough to track them. Everyone would be grown up, so who would care? They put your licenses in a locked online digital store. You just needed to avoid being caught until you turned 20, in less than 2.5 years. Then the store would have opened and backdated the records, and you wouldn't have had to cover up." "You're not making sense, Mom. Who and what are you talking about?" The daughter was beginning to sound desperate. "Your skin, Harper. As long as you wore the UV clothes outside, they couldn't tell you were unlicensed." Despite the mother's admission, Kenzo still needed to get the samples. The young woman's modifications hinted at more than the usual collection of enhancements. They were more extensive than he had ever come across before. Aphrodite had the right to have everything that could be rolled back, reversed, leaving the daughter average or less. The patent holders for the kid's mods he had wrestled with this afternoon had issued orders to that effect by the time he pushed the teen into the collection van. so he knew with certainty the young woman would lose her scholarships and her chance at a better life. He cringed at the idea. It somehow didn't seem fair. "Tell me what happened," he asked, surprising himself. He knew he should just take the samples and let the collection unit detain the two women, but he found himself wanting to hear their story. Harper was still reeling from the fact that she had been designed, probably with stolen gene hacks, as she listened to her mother's story unfold. "For 25 years, I've worked as a lab tech in one of Aphrodite's more prestigious fertility clinics," her mother began to explain. She had stopped crying. "They recruited me off the street and trained me. I was grateful to have the job, although as you can see, it doesn't pay that much." She looked around the container, then back at the IP agent. "But at least we're not in one of the tent cities. I'll never have the money to leave, but Harper, she might have a chance. That's why I agreed to it." "What did you agree to do?" the agent encouraged, appearing to be getting more interested in the story. I was young, and I guess I felt indebted to the people who hired me. My job is to identify viable embryos. Wealthy couples come into the clinic and work with a genetic architect to design the upgrades they want their baby to have. Then the geneticist encode the changes and insert them into embryos. But not all of them are viable." "That's common knowledge, please get to the point," the agent demanded. "About a year after I started, the person who had trained me approached me with a deal. They'd design an embryo for me." Her mother glanced nervously at Harper. "If I would miscount the number of viable ones the geneticist created for the clients. A client usually needs 2 for implantation. However, we often ended up with 4 or more viable embryos. All I did was say we only had 2. Then I let my supervisor know about the other ones. Look, I was getting older and I wanted a child," she said defensively. "All the clients got their upgraded designer babies, so what was the harm in it? At least, that was how I justified it at the time. I knew the extra ones were probably being sold. They had all the best upgrades money could buy, so they would have been valuable. I just wanted my child to have the same chances as those rich couples' kids." Harper's mother began crying again. Please don't take Harper to a rollback clinic," she pleaded. "It's me who should pay for what I did." "Oh, Mom," Harper hugged her mother and stared defiantly at the IP agent. "Are you still involved?" the agent asked, checking something in his contact lens. Her mother shook her head. "No, I only did it until Harper was born. Then I transferred to another clinic. But they held the licenses for Harper's modifications back, so I would keep quiet. I know they'll probably be counterfeit, but if no one looks too closely..." Sophia didn't complete the thought. Instead, she looked nervously at the agent and asked, "So, what happens now?" The man said nothing and appeared to be thinking. Then he glanced at Harper before asking her mother, "How many embryos are we talking about?" Harper's mother winced at the question. "I didn't keep track. A lot, I guess. But they'll all be adults now." "Are you still in contact with the people who put you up to this? Can you give me names?" "Yes, but I haven't heard from them in years." Kenzo zipped his jacket closed and shivered. A cold onshore wind was blowing off the Strait of Georgia, stirring up whitecaps on the shallow, murky water below as he made his way down the outside of the superstructure on the rickety stairs. He had mixed feelings about the agreement he had come to with the woman and her daughter. On any other day, he would have simply taken the samples, then called for collection to detain the two women. He had already run a search on the names he had been given. They were now highly placed in Aphrodite. It explained why the company hadn't been forthcoming about how they wanted the situation handled. Someone there knew what he had discovered. When he acted on the information in 3 years, it would be one of the biggest cases in Sagenetics history and probably destroy Aphrodite. But by then, Harper would have her licenses, and he and the mother had agreed not to mention her when they exposed the scheme. He stopped partway down to compose a message on his contact lens, then sent it, feeling confident Aphrodite would not challenge what he was claiming. Target is legal, just a mix-up with the licenses, sloppy paperwork. Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and middle of the month. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tu. Opening and closing themes composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. Audio production and editing by Makeshift Studios. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons Non-Commercial Attribution No Derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.